Hot FM, number one for news and entertainment.
Welcome to Zambia's hottest radio talk show, The Hot Seat, exclusive to Hot FM 87.7.
Good morning and welcome to Tuesday's edition of your favorite talk show, The Hot Seat. I am your host, Chisha Mwambe, and this morning we're featuring Linda Kasonde, who is a lawyer slash activist, and also someone that will be joining us as well is Chapter 1 Foundation Executive Director, Mr. Josiah Kalala, joining us shortly here on The Hot Seat. Good morning, Linda. Welcome to The Hot Seat.
Good morning, Chisha, and good morning, all the listeners out there.
Yeah, glad you could join us today.
Happy April Fools.
Right. All right, so we're also live on Kwitu FM 93.3 FM and Kanele FM on 97.7 in Lundazi, and also live on our Facebook page, that is Hot FM Zambia. Feel free to go there and also leave a comment, and we might just read that as the show goes on. So our conversation today is mainly focused on the constitutional reforms that have been proposed by the UPND administration. Linda, I'd like to get your overall thoughts on the approach to the constitutional reform process as outlined in the Minister of Justice, Princess Kasonde's speech to Parliament that was done recently.
Thank you for that question, Chisha. I think I'll start off by saying that maybe a lot of people, and I think to some extent it's evident from the minister's statement, that perhaps people don't understand why both the process and the content of constitutional reform is important. Constitutional reform is not a process that should be rushed. It should be consultative. It should be broad-based in that consultation. And the things that you're reforming should be things that the people of Zambia themselves want, that they've been calling for. And as many stakeholders have said, including the Law Association of Zambia, many of these proposed provisions, and of course we haven't seen the actual draft bill, but from what the ministerial statement says, a lot of the provisions came from Bill 10, which the citizens of Zambia resoundingly refused in the last attempt to pass such provisions. So regarding the process, I just want to explain using a metaphor as to why the process is important.
Right.
So it's like cooking in Shima, okay? There's two ingredients, only two simple ingredients to cooking in Shima. Amenshi, no wunga. So you've got to mix the two together. And when you start mixing them, it's important to get the consistency right, because if you don't, there'll be lumps. In the same way with the constitutional reform process, you've got to mix all the ingredients. All the stakeholders have to be on board. And if you don't include all of them in the process, just like the lumps, there'll be problem in the final product. And also, again, using the analogy of cooking in Shima, if you don't leave the Nshima to simmer for enough time, then it'll be undercooked and it won't taste nice. In the same way, if you don't allow enough time for the consultative process, then it becomes rushed and the final product is not satisfactory. And then lastly, regarding the environment in which these reforms happen, many stakeholders in civil society have said it's not a good idea to make these amendments very close to the next general election, which will be held in August 2026. And back to the Nshima analogy, if you put too much heat on the stove, the Nshima is going to burn. And the heat in this example is the political environment, which is very charged. It's very heated during the election time. So you don't get, it's not a good time to bring people together because people are aligning themselves with whatever political party they support.
So when is the right time to cook this Nshima?
The right time to cook the Nshima. First of all, you've got to get at the beginning, get the consistency right, bring in all the stakeholders, include all their views and mix them together to get the final product. You've got to allow enough time for the process. Let it simmer for a little bit. Let people process what they want to see in the constitutional reform process. And finally, you've got to have the right environment. It shouldn't be at a time when the environment is heated, it's charged because of political divisions. It should be a process that brings everyone together.
So when is the right time then? You've described it, but is it 2 years into someone's reign? Is it 1 year into it? When is the right time? There's always this debate around this is not the right time. When is the right time?
Well, it really depends. Some people actually think that the Constitution as it stands is probably the best document we've ever had, and that it just needs refining through testing it in the courts. And then there's others that believe that if you do want to reform the Constitution, the best time to do that would be soon after an election cycle. Because at that time, it's no longer a charged environment, and you can bring people together. And then you have enough time to consult, for people to express their views and to be heard. And just on the consultative process, government has told us that it's too expensive to have a broad-based consultative process. And I tend to disagree with that. And then using another analogy, it's like an elder managing a family meeting, or even a chief managing a meeting in the community. If that elder or chief comes to the meeting and says, I only have 20 minutes for this meeting, I can only hear 5 of you and you each have 1 minute each, is there going to be harmony? Are people going to feel heard? So you need to give enough time for everyone to really express themselves, express their views, understand what the issues are, and do so in an environment that fosters consensus.
Now, you've said that the UPND have resurrected Bill 10. Mm-hmm. What do you mean exactly by that?
Well, again, I'll refer to the last statement. But if you just actually look at the content of what is being proposed in the ministerial statement. Actually, Josiah has just joined us. I'll leave out the delimitation because he talks to that very well. But for example...
let me just welcome in Josiah Kalala, Chapter 1 Foundation Executive Director. Welcome to the hot seat.
Thank you. Good morning, listeners.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Let me give you an example of a provision. So one of them is the need to revise the provisions relating to the filing of fresh nominations on resignation of the candidate in an election. Now, if you recall, in the last constitutional review process under the technical committee, there was a proposal to do away with by-elections so that if the candidate, the incumbent somehow maybe dies or vacates the seat, then the next candidate will take the seat. But according to these proposals, the only thing that's going to change is that there won't be fresh nominations. You'll still have the costly process of doing a by-election. So I can't see the benefit to the people of Zambia, the taxpayers who are paying for this by-election. There'll still be a by-election. It's just that the nominations won't be refiled. And another problem with that is that if it's just a question of doing away with the nominations, then when a government is in office, they have the benefit of incumbency in a by-election. And so they're more likely to win because they've got the state machinery behind them. So I think it's a bit problematic, this particular clause. And then we've talked at length, I mean, many people have talked about the fact that the proposals to include women, youth, and persons with disabilities by increasing the number of nominated MPs is problematic. I mean, firstly, the proposal is that, say, the number of elected women, youth, and disabled persons is 5%. Then the number of nominated MPs will be 5%. 5% will be added to the number of parliamentary seats as nominated MPs. Now, that means there'll be no fixed number of MPs. It will depend on how many of these minority groups are elected. And so that is also problematic in terms of the cost, the resources we don't know, and also the incumbency. So it means that the government in power can decide how many nominated MPs to appoint. And all MPs, including nominated MPs, are voting members of parliament, which means that the government that's in power with these nominated MPs will have more MPs on their side, which will make it easier for them to pass whatever laws they want to make. So that's also problematic. Then there's the provision with regards to the hearing and determination of an election petition, specifically a presidential election petition. Now, if you recall, in 2016, there was a presidential election petition because the now president, President Hakainde Hichilema, challenged the electoral results in 2016, and they went to the Constitutional Court. And there was a controversy as to whether or not a presidential petition should be heard and decided within 14 days, or whether it should be heard in 14 days and then a judgment given at a later date. Now, this issue has already been resolved by the Constitutional Court. And so there's no need to introduce this constitutional reform. It's essentially doing what's already there. So, I mean, I'll stop here because I'd like to allow my colleague, Josiah, to also comment on some of these proposed amendments.
Yes, Josiah, please go ahead with some of these, the points that have been put out by the Justice Minister.
Yeah, thank you. And my apologies for coming late. To begin with, I think we need to maybe ground the conversation to what we need to ground the conversation into what people or what some sections of society are objecting to. And that's primarily around the process. And process entails many different factors. It entails the levels of agreements that citizens have between the government about how the review will be undertaken. Then there's the issue of content. So I hope we'll be able to discuss issues around process later on in the program. But onto the content, how we can approach this conversation, especially around the challenges that have been identified by the government, is it the Constitution that is preventing, is it the Constitution that's causing the problem? So for example, on delimitation, in the minister's speech, she says there's need for equitable distribution of resources. The question is, what in the Constitution is stopping government from equitably distributing resources? What is stopping National Assembly from appropriating resources equitably to large constituencies? That's a function of the National Assembly, to appropriate resources and to oversee the equitable distribution of resources. So there's nothing in the Constitution that's stopping this from happening. So we should have a deeper conversation as to how we approach the exercise of delimitation. And it's been argued by some sections that we're bound by the Constitution itself to delimit constituencies every 10 years. Mm-hmm. The Constitution says, and I'll read so that I don't mislead the listeners. The Constitution says, the Electoral Commission shall, at intervals of not more than 10 years, review the names and boundaries of constituencies and wards.
Yeah, that's Article 58, 5.
Yes. Mm-hmm. So the Constitution mandates a review by ECZ. This review results in new boundaries for wards, districts, and constituencies. The review is mandatory every 10 years, but the application, or rather the implementation of the results of the review, are not mandatory every 10 years. And the Constitution also provides an accountability mechanism. So if ECZ does a review process, a person can apply to the Constitutional Court to review the decision of the Electoral Commission under this article. So the Constitution provides a framework for accountability. Now, the way the proposal's been couched and approached is ECZ will make the proposals and then the Constitution will be amended. What if the decision is challenged and we've got new constituencies, wards, and so on? Will then create further problems. Another way to approach this conversation around delimitation is the Constitution, which prescribes the number of MPs, elected MPs, to 156. So the proposal for the amendment in line with delimitation is that we're likely to have more constituencies, wards for the next election. And so the number of MPs is likely to increase. But where has this conversation taken place? Who knows the number of MPs? The way government has presented it appears they know something that the citizens don't, and that doesn't foster the spirit of transparency and accountability that democracy thrives on.
So with that in mind, is this a self-serving proposal then?
It could be, and I'll again contextualize my answer. So you could have the best intention for carrying out a review, but it has to be protected from abuse, potential abuse. So we might have people who are in office now who will say will be bound by this, I'll call it mystical 5% that the president nominates. What if you have somebody else who comes into power who says, wait, my power is being challenged, I don't have the numbers in National Assembly, I don't have a 2/3 in National Assembly, let me increase the number of nominated MPs. How do we protect against that? And the only way we can do that is by having a deep, in-depth conversation around how we approach the constitutional review process. And for us, primarily, it's around the process. But after the content has been released, or the sort of directions that the content is going, it's also deep concerns around the content. And it's been presented as non-contentious. Who determined what was non-contentious? Who determined the process, this three-phased approach that is being talked about? It has to be arrived at by consensus, because that undermines the legitimacy of the Constitution in the end.
Linda, are these non-contentious issues that they've tabled, as they said?
Well, as I alluded to earlier, some of them are very contentious. For example, we've mentioned the one about the nominated MPs.
Right.
It gives an inbuilt advantage to whoever's in government to have more MPs. And to pass ordinary statutes in Parliament, you just need 50%. So it'll be easy for people to pass to pass statutes without the necessary bipartisan support. And what I mean by bipartisan is the consensus of all political parties rather than just the party in power. And another point about the process, the minister has alluded to the fact that there have already been other constitutional review processes in the past. And I think the last one was before the technical committee was the Mungomba Commission. And that was a long time ago, like well over sort of 13, 14, 15 years ago, something like that. And the thing with reform is you have to bring on board the people at the current time at which you're doing it. So, for example, in 2010, at the last census, there were around just under 14 million Zambians. We're now over 20 million Zambians. So by not reopening the process, allowing everyone to contribute, including the new youth who've become of age, you're effectively disenfranchising 6 million Zambians. So this is a process that can't be rushed. You can't just decide that what was in the past is what's good for us now. You need to allow broad-based consensus and consultation. and allow everyone's voice to be heard in these matters.
Does the aspect of cost effectiveness, trying to bring down costs of this constitutional reform process, sort of compensate for that fact?
Well, back to my analogy of the elder conducting a family meeting, okay? So I said, just say, for example, this person wants the meeting to be held in 20 minutes. So not allowing everyone to speak, and then deciding only 5 people are going to speak. And those 5 people are going to be the children from my household. No one else in the gathering can speak. Is everybody going to feel that that's a fair and inclusive process? Are they going to feel like this person has their interests at heart? Are they going to feel like this process belongs to them? So this is the reason why it's a national document. It doesn't belong to the government, whoever's in power. It belongs to the people of Zambia. And so the people of Zambia must have a say in how this document is formulated and what is in the content as well.
Josiah, you put up your hand there. What did you want to say?
Yes, I just wanted to make another point around the cost. So government has said...
Just kindly ask that you get closer to your microphone.
Government has said that the reason why this approach has been proposed is because it's a least cost approach. And for us from civil society, we are asking, well, let's have a conversation about how we can... Is this really the least cost approach? What options did government consider? Why not have a conversation about how we can minimize costs but ensure that the process is as inclusive as possible? There is a challenge to piecemeal constitutional reforms because we can entrench power structures, existing power structures. So, for instance, Zambians have repeatedly highlighted the power the executive has over the way the other organs of the state operate. So a constitutional reform, a meaningful constitutional reform, should ideally deal with executive power. A meaningful constitutional reform would ideally deal with how we can strengthen judicial autonomy, how we can make the National Assembly Parliament more accountable, more transparent, and really ensure that legislation which is enacted reflects the wills and aspirations of the Zambian people. Now, we can't then just say we're going to amend these specific provisions. We have been told repeatedly that you cannot read a constitutional provision in isolation. So how are we then amending constitutional provisions in isolation? They are bound to impact other aspects of governance. For instance, there's been debate around the independence of the Electoral Commission of Zambia. Fair enough. Let's have a conversation as we're amending the constitution to have new boundaries and districts about how we can strengthen the autonomy and independence of the Electoral Commission of Zambia. Let's have a conversation about how we can strengthen the independence and autonomy of the judiciary. Let's ground this conversation in broader reforms, and that takes time. Right now, we're quite polarized. We're heading into an election. You can only look at what happens in Parliament to see the polarization. We can see how this constitution-making process is polarizing society further. One of the first steps, or one of the key steps in constitution-making, is bridging gaps and ensuring that you have the necessary trust to undertake constitutional reforms. That hasn't happened, and that takes time. At no point have we had our politicians meet and have a sane conversation about how we can improve how we can better achieve the wills of the Zambian people. So let's have a clear roadmap, a broad roadmap that is long-term, that facilitates consensus around the purpose of constitutional reforms. Why do we want to amend the constitution? Do we want to make Zambia more democratic? Okay. Once we agree that we want to make Zambia more democratic, we then agree on what the process to make it more democratic will look like. And a point on this. The proposal, the roadmap has been given by the Ministry of Justice, the executive. And in it, it's laid out what the steps are. At no point in these steps, what we're doing is being considered as part of the consultation process. Who's collecting these views? Is government listening to every conversation happening around the constitution? Government should facilitate it so that when I say I want to be able to recall the MP's midterm, and somebody says, or somebody else proposes another method of holding MPs accountable, there has to be a debate so that we arrive at the best solution for the Zambian people. We're being denied this opportunity. In the roadmap given by the Minister of Justice, the point for consultations happens when the bill is drafted. There, people are consulting over the bill. Why not collect all these different perspectives and then facilitate a dialogue amongst citizens over the best approach and the best recommendations for review, and then draft. Don't let people draft an amendment based, and I'll just refer to the roadmap quickly here. The roadmap says, on the 22nd of April, the Electoral Reform Committee report on delimitation, constituencies, and by-elections, and women, youth, and differently abled participation, that the report will be out on the 22nd. And then on the 23rd of April to the 20th of May, the Ministry of Justice will begin drafting the bill. So a day after the report is ready, the bill drafting will begin. When do citizens interrogate ECZ's recommendations? When do citizens challenge the recommendations? It hasn't been made clear if this will be public. So the consultations happen between the 21st May and the 21st of June, the publication of the bill for consultations. These consultations will be based off the bill that has been drafted without including broad-based consensus on the content. Will be then basically limited to debating, for example, the proposals that government has given. At no place in this roadmap is there a space for where the government is getting citizens' views. So that's a concern around the approach and how the content is being arrived at. We're being limited about what we can debate based off the ECZ's report.
Linda, do you think this short timeline is to prevent what happened to Bill 10 happen to this particular situation here?
I mean, we can only speculate, but I think one thing that's concerning, given the short time frame within which everything is happening, it almost lends credence to the view that there's already a draft, because
which has been denied by the government.
Which has been denied by the government, but we heard
at first we were told, Mr. Clayson Hamasaka said there was a draft. Then the minister came out and said that there was no draft. I mean,
a constitutional reform process should not have predetermined outcomes. So the fact that the proposals are coming from government and not the people is problematic in itself. Because how have they decided that these issues are not contentious? And if you look at these proposals, they're all around, for example, this one, vacancy of minister's office 90 days before the elections. That was decided in the Laz versus the minister's case, right? So why are we amending this? It's already been determined. And why should MPs continue in office when Parliament is dissolved? Because their position as MPs is linked to the life of Parliament. So amending this constitution is essentially amending the fabric of how our constitution works, how our democracy works. You know, we're a mixed presidential and parliamentary system. So amending this is actually quite a fundamental change. And the reason why MPs are not supposed to be in office during elections is so that they don't use government machinery to go out and campaign. Okay? This should be a process by which the party supports you in your campaigning. It should be free from using government and state support. So this clause is contentious, as you can see. The other contentious one is around having the office of the Secretary to the Cabinet, the qualifications reduced from 10 years at PS level to 5 years. That is just reducing the sort of caliber of the person who we want in that office. And you know, these amendments shouldn't be done to suit a specific situation, because Zambia will continue long after any government has come and gone. And what we want is a qualified person who is very seasoned, who's very experienced, who can handle the office. So the solution is not to reduce the qualification, it's to increase the pool by allowing civil servants to be in office long enough to gain the experience.
You don't think 5 years is enough?
Certainly not.
To gain experience in a field?
Well, I mean, the other problem that we have is the politicization of the civil service. So a lot of civil servants don't rise through the ranks. They're effectively political appointees. So it's great to have someone who's risen through the ranks, and when they get to the position of secretary to the cabinet, everyone looks around and says, yeah, that person is qualified. I've seen him. He's worked so here, and here, and this is the best person for the job.
If you just tuned in, this is the Hot Seat here on Hot 87.7. Our guests today, we have Madam Linda Kasonde. She's a lawyer and activist. Also, Josiah Kalala joins us as well, Chapter 1 Foundation Executive Director. We're live on Kwitu FM, 93.3 FM. Also on Kanele FM, that's 97.7 in Lundazi. Also live on our Facebook page, that is Hot FM Zambia. My name is Chisha Mwambe and I'm your host. Let's continue our conversation. There's one of the listed items is mayor term limits. Josiah, what do you think of this particular suggestion or proposal?
So I think the proposal is to remove the term limits for a mayor.
Yes.
And
the 2-term cap.
I for this entire debate around the constitutional reforms, I've wanted to ground our arguments firstly in the process, the challenges with the process, and then the content. So the process. Who suggested that we need to remove this cap? Why don't we have a conversation about why the cap was put and then debate what the best solution is? On the term limit, I think an idea could be for the 2-term limit is to not entrench power in single individuals. But let's broaden the debate to members of parliament. Let's have a debate and a conversation about what is the best solution for the people of Zambia. We're being denied the opportunity to debate these proposals effectively. On the term limit, for removal of the term limit, I think there's a reason why term limits are included for different positions. And like I mentioned earlier, one of the reasons is to prevent the entrenchment of power in an individual.
No third term.
Essentially, to
Right.
prevent that. So what is the justification for the removal? And I think in the minister's speech, if I can just refer to it, I believe it was an issue of harmonization, if I'm not mistaken. Now, if we're harmonizing the issue of term limits, how do we deal with the fear that one day they'll say, no, let's harmonize the presidency also. Let's remove the term limit from the president to make it harmonized with MPs and mayors who have no term limits. I think those are the dangers. And just to mention, constitution making comes with inherent risks. One of the risks is changing the constitution to deal with a single individual or for the benefit of a single individual. Our history of constitution making is littered with those examples. People said we had a constitutional amendment to prevent Kaunda from standing. We've had a constitutional amendment to entrench UNIP in power as a one-party state. That's a challenge or a risk that comes with constitution making. So what's the appropriate approach? The appropriate approach is having a conversation about how these risks can be mitigated and can be circumvented throughout the process. I was making a point earlier around the importance of agreements around the process. If, for instance, Zambians say they want a more accountable executive, and we leave the constitution making in the hands of the executive to control the process, what guarantees are there that it won't be a self-serving constitutional amendment to protect the executive from further accountability or scrutiny? So one way to mitigate that risk is to have an independent body do the drafting of the constitution, for example. We've seen that happen in Kenya, and we've seen versions of it happen here. The technical committee drafted the 2016 amendments and handed them over to the Ministry of Justice that made further revisions to them. So we have to mitigate the risks that come up with constitution making, and we haven't done that in this instance. We've seen proposals that have been made with no in-depth conversation about how the risks that those proposals raise will be mitigated. And in the ideal situation, all these things, the entire roadmap, will set out, firstly, the process of arriving at pre-drafting agreements and consensus. It will come up with agreements and consensus on the drafting stage, what the drafting stage will look like. But even beyond just the pre-drafting, the drafting, the roadmap should set out a timeline and a step-by-step process for the post-enactment. One of the challenges we have with our current constitution is we have provisions that aren't given effect because we just enacted the law and we didn't have enough foresight, I'll put it as, to debate on how and when, for instance, the Gender Equity and Equality Commission will be established, how and when the political parties bill will be enacted. So there are so many gaps because we only plan for the drafting stage, but there's a post-drafting stage that is also critical to ensuring that the constitution is given full effect, which we haven't done.
Right. Now, Linda, are there any good clauses that have been proposed here, or is this an entirely just bad? Are all the proposals just bad and shouldn't have even been brought up in the first place?
Well, I'll speak
because some people will say people are just bashing, but is there any good that's in these proposals that have been put on the table?
I'll speak from my own perspective. I've mentioned a few of the clauses that are very problematic, and then I don't think there's anything that the people of Zambia have been asking for that is contained in here. Everything is self-serving for the government itself, for the ruling party. Okay, everything helps them gain an advantage in increasing their power in government. There are a few. I mean, they've thrown in a few things like this revision of the definitions of child and adults, which are neither here or there. Those things can be sorted out through judicial interpretation. And then also the other one was the one around the ministers vacating. Again, that's something that's already been decided. So they've thrown in a few things that look harmless. And then most of the clauses are actually potentially very harmful in the sense that they undermine democracy. They undermine, firstly, our current constitutional system in which we have a direct vote. We vote our members of parliament, and we know we have a fixed number in parliament, so we know how many constituencies there are, and that each MP represents citizens within a constituency. So to just increase that number by adding an unfixed number of nominated MPs only serves the ruling government. And we've talked at length as civil society about the fact that there were other ways to address this issue. Josiah has mentioned on another platform that the political parties bill could be another avenue to address the problem of the lack of representation of youth, women, and persons with disabilities. Because the real problem comes at political party level. There's no shortage of women and youth that present themselves for election, for adoption by political parties. The problem is the gatekeepers in these political parties that do not allow these people to get adopted, and therefore they don't go on the ballot paper. And so people can't vote for them. That is the real problem, and that can be addressed through putting provisions in a political party's bill that mandate political parties to be more representative in the people who they adopt for an election.
So just on that, no, Josiah, you want to add something? Please go ahead.
Yes, I think, again, this is also a personal opinion. There are most stakeholders will agree that we need to review our constitution, and for a number of reasons. One of them is the by-election issues, which has been presented here. The issue of a candidate resigning before an election and calling for fresh nominations, and sort of the perpetuity that might cause. Now, even where there are genuine concerns, it has to be addressed within a process that ensures it's not abused. So a lot of the provisions, for instance, the one on the resignation of an MP or a candidate before an election, citizens, this could cause a problem, but it has to be reviewed within a process where consensus is facilitated. The one on by-elections, I think everybody in this studio, for example, agree we don't want by-elections. But then what is the solution? Is it the party that will nominate somebody to fill in? What's the solution? There are different solutions for nominating a candidate that dies and so on, shifts. The solution is contentious. There's no agreement on the solution. And the process which is built on consensus building would facilitate that. There's an expression I've been repeating around this debate. Constitution making should unite a country. Through the various agreements citizens make as the process develops, we're building consensus and agreements and uniting the country. If a process is dividing the country, then you're likely to undermine the legitimacy of the final product. And in this process, there's a lot of division already. It's only polarizing society further. So rather than trying to push this process forward, why not take a step back and see, let's meet the citizens and let's agree on what the process long term should look like, what the purpose of this should be, what the points of consensus that are required are, who's required for that consensus, how will we engage citizens. Something I came across is for the technical committee drafting the constitution. It was initially supposed to review previous recommendations, but then they felt the need to go around and consult, and they developed guidelines for how they would undertake those consultations. Now, on the question of cost, let's also agree, because we want to see the constitution meaningfully amended. Let's agree on how we can minimize the high costs that the government envisages. And if you look at the cost, it might, in the end, be allowances. If people truly want to see a constitution that works for the Zambian people, I'm sure many people are willing to forego their allowances to make a contribution to a document that meets the needs and aspirations of the Zambian people. Yeah.
Just want to get your thoughts on the enhanced representation, and I know we've touched on it during our conversation. Do you think this is a good idea, first of all, or should we just stick to a system of meritocracy?
So, was that for me or for Linda?
Anyone can take that.
Yes.
Sure.
So, I think nobody will say they do not want to see more equitable representation of the various interest groups, women, youth, persons with disability, and so on. The question is how we achieve that and what the bottlenecks are. So I asked the question when I first came on, what in the Constitution is preventing more women, more youth, and more persons with disability from being elected? Is there a specific text in the Constitution, or it's something else? And whilst different electoral systems, for instance, proportional representation, or having a selected seats reserved for specific interest groups, can facilitate that. In Zambia, like Linda mentioned, the problem goes deeper than that. The women's movement, for instance, has done research upon research on some of the barriers to political participation of women. And it's things like sexual harassment within political parties. It's things like the cost of elections. That's not something in the constitution that's preventing that. So currently, and there's been a lot of debate around how we can achieve greater representation. And as Chapter 1 Foundation and some of the civil society we work with, we've said Article 259 gives some indication of how we can achieve this. Article 259, Article 45, I believe, 45 or 47, and Article 60. So Article 259 provides that if you are empowered to appoint or nominate for public office. So for appointments, Chapter 1 went to court and challenged the lack of nominations of female and youth by the president from his 8 and in cabinet. And the Constitutional Court held that it's discretionary and might not apply to the president, or does not apply to the president. But Article 259 goes beyond the president. It goes to any person who's empowered to nominate for public office. What do political parties do when they're receiving nominations or applications for nominations? They nominate candidates for public office to stand as MP, which is a public office. So why aren't political parties ensuring that 50% of their nominations reflect both are gender sensitive? Why aren't political parties ensuring that nominations they nominate more youth, more persons with disability? That's where the problem is.
It's not a problem with the constitution, it's just the political parties themselves.
And to go a step further, the Article 45 that provides the principles for the electoral system says we shall have an electoral system that shall, this is mandatory, ensure equitable representation of both genders in the National Assembly and councils. That's mandatory. So the electoral system has to achieve that. The electoral system, in our electoral system, the primary vehicle for participation are political parties. So Article 60, which provides for political parties, provides that political parties are mandated to give effect to the values and principles in the Constitution, which include ensuring gender equity at National Assembly and Parliament. Who is responsible for overseeing or implementing the electoral system? The Electoral Commission of Zambia. So, with these provisions in mind, what now, is it the Constitution stopping ECZ from directing political parties to say, look, the electoral system has to result in this? Why aren't you nominating more women, youth, and persons with disability for public office? Because this is all within the current framework. And to give some context to this debate and argument is, in Kenya they have similar provisions, and after the election, when their constitution was amended, after the election, the representation in the National Assembly did not reflect what the constitution provided. And the parties went to court, and their constitutional court gave an advisory. It said the provisions aren't meant to be implemented immediately. It has to be progressively achieved. So how do we in Zambia progressively achieve this? We do this by ensuring that political parties nominate more women, youth, and persons with disability. We do this by ensuring that the ECZ fulfills its mandate of implementing the system of elections to result in more equitable representation of the various interest groups.
I'd like to get your thoughts on that as well, Linda.
Well, I am obliged to agree because the case that he mentioned that Chapter 1 took out, I was with Chapter 1 at the time, and we basically argued that since the 2016 amendments to the Constitution, the government is mandated under Article 259 to ensure that there's gender equity and equitable representation of youth and persons with disabilities. So we actually lost the case in the Constitutional Court, like Josiah said, because the court decided that what was reasonably possible was within the discretion of the government. And we've actually challenged that. We've actually taken up that case to the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, and we're waiting for a judgment there. And if successful, it will have an impact on gender equity, not just in Zambia, but across the African continent. So we look forward to receiving that judgment. But just as Josiah is saying, even in the current framework, it is possible to get a more equitable representation of women, youth, and disabled persons. But successive governments, and actually starting from the PF, because the amendments were only made in 2016 that brought on this inclusion of gender equity and youth and disabled persons. So from the PF in 2016 onwards, governments have been refusing to abide by those constitutional provisions. Because, let me say this about particularly gender equity, it actually requires deliberate effort, because particularly women are socialized to shy away from political office, etc. So you have to be deliberate about bringing them in. It requires some effort, and you can't just say this is not possible. It's very possible if you look, and if you allow those who present themselves for adoption to come through. So the problem is more systemic. It's about our society and how we view women as equal partners in this society, and how society also does not value the contributions of the youth and disabled persons. That's the real problem. The provisions are there, as Josiah has been saying. What is lacking is political will to execute on these provisions.
And there's the issue of the public gatherings bill. I know this has been something that's been flouted for quite a long time now. And it's interesting that we're talking about amending the Constitution when there was already the issue of the public gatherings bill. Do you think we'll see this enacted into law anytime soon?
I think Josiah is closer to this issue than I am, so I'll let him speak about it.
I think it will potentially will, because government announced the day the minister made the statement, there was a news item saying the public gatherings bill will be enacted before the 2026 elections. But again, I'll contextualize this. Human rights are enjoyed within specific contexts. So there are other contextual issues that have to be addressed to ensure people can better enjoy their right to association, movement, protest, and so on. And some of those are, for instance, having a police that's more independent, more accountable, more transparent, and is there to actually serve the people of Zambia. If today I wanted to do a one-man protest, and I told the police that I'd like to do a one-man protest, chances are they would say no, they've heard security threats, or there's a security concern or something. And that's when we talk about reviewing legislation, we need to situate and look at what are some of the contextual issues that need to be addressed to fully realize these rights. An independent judiciary, an accountable executive, transparent executive, institutions that are designed from the design perspective to ensure that citizens enjoy their rights, which we currently don't have. So what one might argue, what benefit might we get if we amend the public gatherings bill but leave the police in their current form? We'll still be getting protesters arrested. So we need to look at some of the contextual issues, and this is one of the challenges with sort of a piecemeal approach to an issue. Governance is interconnected. So a law on its own does not address the issues it's meant to address. It has to have certain institutions that contribute to ensure its application. It has to have citizens willing to exercise their right. There are several societal factors that have to be considered as part of a reform process.
So then what needs to happen on the police side for that to work perfectly in harmony?
In just before 2021, there was the former president instituted an inquiry of sorts to inform police reforms. We haven't had serious police reforms in a very long time. We've changed the text from a police force to a police service, but what do actual reforms look like? What does an accountable police look like? So we need comprehensive institutional reforms of not just the police. There are lots of different factors. For instance, if protesters are arrested and charged, they'll be prosecuted? How can we ensure greater prosecutor accountability? How can we ensure greater judicial independence in decision making? So all those factors have to be considered in a reform process, and this sort of grounds our call for comprehensive constitutional reforms that then inform greater institutional or more comprehensive institutional reforms after the constitution is reviewed.
Okay, Linda, you agree?
Well, actually, what I wanted to say, I mean, Josiah has spoken a lot about the context of things. And I would like to speak about the context within which these constitutional reforms are happening. Okay? Are these reforms enhancing our democracy? And I would argue that they're not. And the most troubling thing about it is the context within which these reforms are happening. We've seen the government is trying to pass the cybersecurity and cybercrimes bills, which will reduce freedom of expression online. Okay? These are all things that they're trying to pass before the 2026 general elections. We've seen that government, in addition, is trying to pass a new NGO bill to try and limit the operations of NGOs, to try and to control them, if you like, more. We've seen the attempts to pass a statute to regulate the media. Okay, so these are all things that affect the civic space within which citizens can freely exercise their rights and privileges as citizens under our Bill of Rights in the Constitution. And this is happening at the same time as constitutional reforms that effectively are trying to enhance the power of the incumbent government to remain in power and to make it easier for them to win elections. So the whole context in which we are operating does not inspire confidence that we're heading in the right direction in terms of our democracy. It's extremely concerning because it seems that our rights are being snatched away from us. And they may be very difficult to recover in the event that these constitutional reforms go ahead, because there'll be an inbuilt majority of the ruling party, whichever ruling party it is, after the election. And it'll make it harder for civil society to challenge them, for the media to challenge them, for ordinary citizens to challenge what is happening, what the government's actions. So context is very important, and I'm sure Josiah would like to add to that.
It's just there's this question that's been bugging me around these reforms.
I'll just ask that you're brief because we need to pick up some phone calls now.
It's this 5% sort of proportion ratio that the president is entitled to. Where does it come from? From my civics, I never learned about, the president has to have a 5% number of MPs to represent him. It's just, I'm curious, where does this 5% come from? It's very new. I've only heard of it in 2025.
Okay. Interesting there. Give us a call, 0974-870-877. Call us now for you to be part of this conversation. Today we have Linda Kasonde, who's a lawyer and activist. Also Josiah Kalala, who is Chapter 1 Foundation Executive Director.
You're listening to The Hot Seat on Hot FM 87.7. It's time for you to call now and get involved. Call now and get involved.
All right, give us a call now. We'd love to get your question or contribution.
Hello, good morning.
Hello, good morning. Who do we have there?
This is our Brighton Sakala.
All right, Brighton, you're through to the hot seat.
Good, thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to comment on the delimitation amendment bill. Maybe if the government, I like what Madam Linda she's saying, but then maybe the government should mention the constituencies that they want to delimitate, because there is an assertion to say they want to delimitate their strongholds so that they can have more representation, and which is actually going to be wrong for the opposition and it's an advantage to them. So I think these constitutional amendments are really favoring the government than the rest, or saving the ordinary Zambians.
Thank you, Brighton.
Thank you.
All right. Interesting comment there. We'll ask our panelists to respond after we pick up 2 more calls. Hello, good morning.
Yes, good morning. How are you?
Well, thanks. How are you?
Yeah, you are talking to Honorable MBX Chironda, Morgan Chironda.
All right, please go ahead, Mr. Chironda.
Yeah, Chrome, good morning, Chrome, Tisha.
Good morning.
Yeah. And Kasonde Rinda, good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
And once I knew that you were the Lawyer Association president. Yeah, for me, what I'm saying, you know, we have so many dormant laws in this country, but some laws need to be upset. If we say we need more youth in parliament, we need for more women at stability in the parliament, disability, and women in the governance system. Is it a problem? Now, you see, one thing what you can talk about is that being an opposition, don't politicize everything. Everything is bad, but you need to look at the articles, which is the articles which are good. Oh, this is good, this is bad. Why can't you remove this? If you see that most of youth are used as a tools of violence, I think you look and go and pick this one. But you know, when you got independence, men who got independence were youth. Kaunda was 40 years. Ministers 35 years, even in VJ 18 years and an ambassador. So now we want you to engage themselves into governance issues. Talk about, not say that is.
All right, Morgan, we need you to conclude, please.
So that's what we need. So for me, don't accuse and refute everything. But there's an article which are good. Can you recommend that good articles? About the articles.
All right,
Did
Morgan.
you read all the articles? I thank you.
All right, Morgan. We appreciate your call. 0974-870-877. Do give us a call now. Hello, good morning.
Hello.
Hello, good morning. Who do we have there?
Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning. What's your name?
Gilbert calling.
All right, Gilbert, you're through to the hot seat. Please go ahead.
Yeah. Yes. Good morning, Madam Linda.
Good morning. How are you?
You say we are good.
Good.
I don't know why people sometimes argue out of ignorance. Sorry for using this term. You are a lawyer by profession. You understand the law better than some of us. The Law Association of Zambia have also said this thing. In fact, we can say all the major stakeholders, including the church, have also advised the government not to go ahead with it. The same Linda Kasonde, she is the same person who also against the Bill 10. Today, she can stood firm to say this is also not the right thing. People want to say, no, we want to include women and the youth. Which youth are you going to include if you have failed to include them? Just a recent appointment, they have appointed somebody who is more than 100 years old, who replaced in Combo. Eh?
Well, he's not over
Why
100
people are
years.
behaving like this?
Gilbert, he's not over 100 years. That's an exaggeration.
So whichever. What I'm trying to put across is, these Valinda Kasonde, these are the people who stood firm to oppose Bill 10. Again, today they are saying, no, you can't do this. Because it will be very unfair for Valinda Kasonde to go on radio to start supporting this same move, which was also introduced in Bill 10. But a woman with integrity stood firm to say this is not right. Here is a UPND cadre again scandalizing an innocent woman who is just telling the nation the truth to say, no, we want to include the women. Let's talk about bringing the MP to council. Is that a proper clause? If you analyze it, we wanted to decentralize this country so that council chairperson should also preside over the affairs of the district. The member of parliament, let's also now pushing for money in the district.
We need you to conclude, please.
In conclusion, what I'm saying is, Valinda, continue speaking on behalf of forget about these UPND cadres. They are the West democratically. Thank you.
All right, there we go. We've had Brighton, Morgan, and Gilbert. Linda, your name came up with Gilbert there, so we'll allow you to start with your response.
Thank you. I think it's quite telling that most of the calls that we've received have had some reservations about this constitutional reform process. Brighton mentioned the delimitation process and his fear that it might be used to create new constituencies in the stronghold of any incumbent government. That's a very real risk. It happens in other countries. We see it in the United States, for example, where boundary lines are drawn to advantage the incumbent government. So it is a definite risk that this could happen as well. So we have to be very careful. Well, but the other thing I wanted to mention is, I don't think, has anyone seen the report from ECZ around this delimitation process? The whole process has been shrouded in mystery. It hasn't been transparent and accountable, so that we can say, have a look at the report and say, okay, maybe there's something they're saying that is useful here that we can apply in terms of the review of the boundaries. But without that, it's very difficult to speak with authority and say that, in fact, there is need to create a new constituency, and this is the basis for doing so. We need that report to be released so that we can understand what the basis is for saying we need new constituencies. Because bearing in mind, new constituencies means new MPs, and that is those are new allowances that have to be paid. Those are new Hiluxes or whatever car that they drive. The
VXs.
VX, rather. Right. Exactly, yes. That's a very huge cost to the Zambian. So why do we need to do that? There needs to be a good justification, which we all need to see and accept before we can move forward with that process. With regards to Honorable Chilonda, I don't know at what point you joined the conversation, because I was asked what I thought were the good and what were the bad clauses that are being proposed. Now, again, we haven't seen the draft bill, but based on the ministerial statement, the majority of the proposals just help to entrench the government in power. They're just two proposals that are, I would say, harmless. Well, neither here or there. One is the one about defining who a child is, and the other one is around determining the when a presidential petition should be heard and determined. Now, as I mentioned earlier, regarding the presidential petition, that's already been decided by the Constitutional Court. So why are we amending that? The issue of the child, that's something that could be determined through judicial interpretation. The rest of the clauses do nothing except, for example, the nominated MPs increase an incumbent government's number of representatives and then therefore give them an advantage in parliament. The lowering of the bar for the secretary of the cabinet doesn't help anybody. It's only taking us back, because now we'll have a less qualified secretary to the cabinet. There's nothing there that I think is pressing that the Zambians really want and need. So I think I'll stop there. I don't know if Josiah wants to comment.
If I can just comment. And I think the comment from Brighton on the delimitation exercise, as Linda's pointed out, lacks the transparency necessary for such change. And like Linda's pointed out, it would result most likely, as has been advanced, that there'll be more MPs in Parliament. And this is where one of our concerns comes from. I'll ask the Zambian people, the people listening, will having more MPs address the problems they currently have? Is it really the number of MPs that's a problem for our context? On the point mentioned by Honorable Chilonda Morgan, I think he said when Kaunda came into power, there were young people in office and so on. A question that I asked earlier is, firstly, has there been an amendment to the law since then that says don't appoint young people or don't nominate young people? There hasn't. And the point is, if you don't have gender, you don't have youth interests, you don't have the interests of persons with disability in your heart, in your institution, you won't find it in the constitution. And that's where the problem is. I think on the question of decentralization, Zambians have been calling for devolution in its truest sense. That calls for more divisions between the national and subnational actors. So what we're seeing by, for instance, the recommendation to have MPs in councils is more commingling of, firstly, national level actors in local actors' affairs. And that goes against devolution that the Zambian people have been calling for. So there's need for a more nuanced conversation around how, firstly, what the problem is and what the best solution for that problem is. So, for instance, is it the uptake of CDF, as has been argued? Does having an MP then, will that increase the uptake of CDF? Let's have these nuanced conversations about what the best solutions are.
All right. Let's pick up some more calls. 0974-870-877. Call us now. Hello, good morning.
Good morning, Chromez.
Good morning.
Good morning, Madam Melinda and the other guest.
Good morning.
Good morning.
This is Danny.
Yes, Danny. Go ahead.
Let me...
Sorry, Danny, your line is not too clear. Danny, you have to call us back. You have to call us back. The line is pretty bad there. Call us now. Hello, good morning.
Good morning, Honorable and Madam Linda.
Good morning.
Dr. Brown. You and that guy, you are the person who can direct the country where to go, including to assist our Republican President Hagan Hijirema. If you say your PM has brought back the bill change, which means it's good, because the PM, they wanted to bring bill change, but in myself, it's not the bill change where PM will bring it. For example, we got the MOP, they are not sitting in the country. When you tour the whole Lusaka, all of that, including if you listen to the swearing in of local government minister, Charuba, they were all the do not have a photo. As if there is no council. Council are being paid, but they are not mending the road. When you balance a relative in Chingwere, you want to find it. This one, they wanted to delimitate. Member of parliament, for example, I'm in Mandel. In MOP, you can't do the whole Mandel. I was in session with Trumbo Mutinje. The same. What we were saying, you civil organization. I can't only remind you, Madam Linda, no matter who can talk, UPND government is not going to listen on your advice because you are part of the NGO. President Hakainde has been voted by 20,000, 18,000 Zambians. Where were you? Where government for President Lungu? We are in Kassas, where marketing was being shut at Prima TV. Post newspaper for maybe no matter the supporting was being
Dr. Proud, we need you to conclude, please.
But you are busy criticizing over constitution. Today's opening a Mulugu sector, people will be getting news and you call youth junkies. Have we ever President Hakainde calling any youth junkies? The answer is no. He's employing youth, in health, in the police to make sure the name of the junkie must.
All right, Dr. Proud, we've given you enough time. Thank you so much. Interesting comments there. 0974-870-877. Call us now. Hello, good morning.
Yes, morning.
Good morning. What's your name? Hot FM. Zina yanu ati Nwanda?
Zulu Njovu Pakavata.
Okay, please go ahead, Njovu.
Yeah, so my question do you think UPND is posting the constitution on Zambian?
Njovu, your line is not too clear. If you have us on loudspeaker, just use your mouthpiece, please. Hello?
Yes, can you hear me?
Well, we'll try and listen closely. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm asking my question to the guest is do you think the UPND government is forcing the constitution on Zambians or what?
Did you say, are they forcing these amendments on the Zambians? Is that what you said? think that's what he said there. All right, we'll take a note of that question. Call us now. Hello, good morning.
Good morning, Shish. How are you?
Well, thanks. How are you?
Thank you so much. This is Brother Shisha in Lusaka. Madam
right.
Linda Kasonde, how are you and other panelists today?
Hello, I'm well, thank you. How are you?
I'm okay, thank you.
Good.
Please go ahead.
I have a question for you. Which criteria these people uses to land on causes which are contentious and non-contentious on the Constitution? Do they conduct a referendum for Zambians to tell them to say these are contentious and these are non-contentious? Because you can't come up with the 13 clauses in the Constitution.
All right. Well, thank you for your call. I think the line may have just gone dead there, but I think we got a gist of what you were trying to say. Josiah, let's start with you. Your response to the calls that we received.
Yes. So, Dr. Proud talked about there are potholes, so we need MPs in councils. There were potholes when MPs were in councils, so that is not obviously the solution. The point is, how can we make, for instance, local authorities more accountable? That's a conversation that should inform constitutional reforms. And when Zambians say we want more devolution also entails greater accountability for subnational actors. So the solution isn't to have more MPs in councils. We cannot assure the Zambian people that if you get an MP into a council, then potholes would disappear, or then councils will suddenly run it more efficiently. That's another conversation. On the point about whether the UPND is forcing the constitution on Zambians, government's role is supposed to facilitate this dialogue. And right now, government announced, or the president announced, we agreed, there's been different back and forths, and the Minister of Justice issued a statement and issued proposed areas. At some point, it was announced that there were submissions received by the Ministry of Justice, but this hasn't happened in a transparent manner. So in the absence of knowing, for instance, who submitted, what they submitted, what was the basis for accepting one submission over another if they're conflicting submissions, it's difficult to say where the government got these proposals. And that's why we say the process has to be clear, and the process is what then protects the content. Again, on the process, to the point Brother Chisha mentioned, at no point has there been an agreement to say this is contentious or not contentious. It's actually quite undermining of the intelligence of Zambians to say this is not contentious, so you don't need to bother. We've agreed with somebody that this is not contentious. And even then, while the problem might be non-contentious, what the solution is might be a point of contention. And so there are two ways to address this. Firstly, ensuring that the process is transparent and open for debate, but also ensuring that the process has inbuilt dispute resolution mechanisms. So if there's a dispute, for instance, around what the solution for replacing an MP is rather than having a by-election, how will the dispute be resolved? Would it be an independent actor, or it would be the people with an interest to serve that would be charged with resolving the dispute? So I'll end there.
All right, Linda, any responses there?
Yes, I think to Mr. Njovo's point, he asked, is the current government forcing these amendments on Zambians? It's a very good question, because where have these amendments come from? Have they come from the people? I've been listening to the radio, TV, since this whole debate began about the proposed amendments. And I'm seeing a lot of resistance from the Zambian people. So I think it's incumbent on the ruling party, the government, to reflect on these issues, and perhaps even to go back to the drawing board, so that, as Josiah has been talking about, have a more inclusive, open and transparent process that is more democratic in nature, that really says to us that this is something that the people want, rather than something where we're speculating where these ideas are coming from. We don't know. The minister in her ministerial statement has listed, I think it's 10 different organizations that were consulted. Is that sufficient? Given the size of our population, which is now over 20 million people. So these are questions that the government really needs to ask of itself. So I think I've spoken a bit to the issue of whether an issue is contentious or non-contentious, because in my view, certainly, a lot of these proposals are contentious.
The question also would be, are there any non-contentious issues in the Constitution? Not with the proposals, just generally, if there was something that could be touched in the Constitution, is there anything that we would say is non-contentious, or is everything a point of contention?
I think, again, because we can't read a single provision on its own, we've been told that repeatedly, we then can't say a provision is non-contentious because it might impact other aspects of governance. And this is the point of building consensus. If people understand the why and the what, the solution, then you have a better basis of building consensus over what is contentious and non-contentious. For example, most people you ask will say, we need to review the Constitution. So we need to review the Constitution, but we have to do it right. And what does doing it right mean? It means building the necessary consensus at the levels where it is required. And if I can just steal some more airtime. So what are some of the levels where consensus is required? So firstly, we need consensus on the purpose and the objectives of the reforms. Then we need consensus on the scope of the reforms. And why the objectives is when we say, for instance, we want to make Zambia more democratic, institutions more accountable, then the scope of the reforms will be informed by the purpose. Then we need to build consensus around the process, what the process will look like. We need to build consensus on the dispute resolution mechanism. We need to build risk mitigation mechanisms. We can't, for instance, entrust, as has happened in the past, where citizens say we want provincial assemblies, and it's presented in parliament, and the whole part on provincial assemblies is removed. So we can't then leave the process entirely to be controlled by an institution or a level of governance that might have an interest to serve. So you mitigate these risks by ensuring that the process is firstly accepted by the people and the people are aware. In this entire conversation, for instance, there's been one of the proposals is to introduce a mixed member system. Now, what that entails is revising the system of elections. We'll have some elected by first past the post, who might have proportional representation, in whatever format. Who's agreed on what the proportions are? When do we have these agreements? Who's agreed what the mixture of systems will be? When do we have these agreements? And we need those agreements before the process is done. So, I think
right. Okay.
It's not. We can't say specific provisions are non-contentious. There's bound to be contention on different things.
Linda, I just want to get your thoughts on this. How would you describe the human rights situation in the country, and how has the UPND administration fared on this score?
I'll start by saying that we had a lot of hope after 2021. The government reached out to civil society and requested civil society to help them, to give them ideas of what needed strengthening in the governance system of our country. And amongst the suggestions that civil society made were some issues around constitutional reform with regards to the Bill of Rights, with regards to strengthening public institutions such as the judiciary, and increasing transparency and accountability in other public offices. We called for the amendment of the Public Order Act. We called for the repeal of the NGO Act. We called for I think the Cybersecurity Act was also something that we looked into. And if I were to score the government against those things, in terms of whether it has enhanced democracy in our country, the trends are not looking so good. As I mentioned earlier, the proposed cybersecurity and cybercrimes bills do not enhance freedom of expression. If anything, they take away from citizens' rights to freely express themselves on online platforms, and thereby restrict the civic space within which citizens can act. The proposed NGO bill, also something that's going to Parliament shortly, is something that constrains civil society by controlling them and how they're financed, how they report to this body under the NGO Act. These are things that also undermine democracy, because aside from the multi-party system we have, civil society plays a role in enhancing accountability of governance. So it is a very worrying thing to see that NGOs are equally being constrained. I also mentioned that there have been utterances by the Minister of Information that they want to revert back to the idea of regulating media houses. Another item which is very unwelcome, because it will again limit citizens' access to information and therefore limit their ability to make informed decisions on matters that concern them, national issues. So these are all very worrying trends. And again, as I mentioned, this is the context within which these constitutional reforms are being done. So it's all quite concerning to those of us in the civic space.
So they score quite low on your cards?
Yes.
How about your cards, Josiah?
I think human rights, it's a difficult question, because I think it's rather than out of 10 or something, I think it's pretty much the same. And I'll justify this.
When you say the same, what do you mean?
As the previous administration. And the justification for this is we have to look at what government itself is doing in terms of the violations. So are we seeing improved police conduct? Not necessarily. And for Chapter 1, we do human rights monitoring, and we monitor at structural level, process level, and outcome level. At structural level, we're looking at legislation or policy that's been developed, but not just that it's been enacted. For instance, the Access to Information Act. It does not benefit the Zambian people to say we've enacted an Access to Information Act with a provision that restricts access to information relating to policy development and implementation, because government implements nearly all its activities within the framework of a policy. So that means you're essentially denying citizens access to information relating to how government functions. In Lunda we say muhana mpembi mukwata kumchila, which means you give a goat and hold the tail. That's what such pieces of legislation do. We can't say, oh, we've repealed the defamation of the president provision, but still enact a whole host of provisions in other pieces of legislation that can still get people arrested for expressing discontent against the president. So I think there's room for a more structured investigation as to the impact of some of the human rights, the progress in terms of human rights that we've witnessed. And something we've noticed as Chapter 1 Foundation is there's not as much highlighting of, for instance, arrests and so on as there have been in the past. And that's maybe something for broader society to consider in terms of how can we ensure that we're not sweeping or being complicit in the sweeping of abuses under the carpet. So I think there was a lot of optimism, but that's sort of dying down. But, and to the government, there's room to change this narrative. There's lots of room to change this narrative. There are lots of actors, lots of citizens who are willing to share recommendations of how they can improve. And it just requires putting the words into action of being a listening government.
Do you think they've exhibited the attributes of a listening government for those, opinions to be heard and enacted?
So, for example, and I'll give this constitutional debate as an example. The president first announces, we've agreed, and there's a lot of backlash from different sectors of society. There's some clarification given, there's no draft, but there's still this backlash. What would the listening government do in this instance? Would it stand firm in its position that we're going to proceed, or it would then facilitate dialogue to see what the concerns are, to hear what citizens' views are on what the process should look like? That I'll leave that to the Zambian citizens to consider. Take the cyber bills, which were passed by National Assembly. We raised concerns over the lack of protections. We want cyber legislation. We want to control the cyber. We think the cyberspace should be controlled in a way that firstly facilitates the enjoyment of rights, but also ensures that citizens' rights are not infringed. But there have to be protections against potential misuse, right? And we raise these concerns. For instance, the Cybersecurity Agency. Why isn't it more accountable to the National Assembly? We're seeing in the US, for example, the heads of the different secret service and different agencies are being summoned to Congress to answer questions over a chat. Why can't we have institutions that are more accountable? If we don't start designing and creating accountable institutions now, when do we do it? We have an opportunity with each piece of legislation that we enact to make institutions more accountable, more transparent as we grow our democracy. That has been rejected. At least from the bill I've seen, there's no accountability mechanism for this institution. So in terms of whether they are listening and have exhibited this, they have on some parts. For instance, they did defer the bills and did facilitate a conversation with civil society, but the outcome is still pretty much what it was before. So I think more can be done, and there are some instances where they have listened. There's a lot where they haven't.
Okay. Well, we have to end here. I'd like to thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
All right. All right, this has been the Hot Seat here on Hot 87.7. Now, guests have been Linda Kasonde, a lawyer and activist, also Josiah Kalala, Chapter 1 Foundation Executive Director. We've been live on Kwitu FM 93.3, also on Kanele FM 97.7 in Lundazi, and also on our Facebook page. I'd like to thank you so much for joining us today. And look out for the next edition of the Hot Seat. That'll be on Thursday with my colleague Peter Zulu. Stay tuned to Hot 87.7. Up next is the Urban Vibe.